Chapter 18. Myths and Legends of All Nations. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Lucy LaFaro, New South Wales, Australia. Myths and Legends of All Nations by Logan Marshall. Wayland the Smith. King Nidung had one daughter and 3 sons. The oldest son, Otvin, was away from court, guarding the outposts of the country. The other 2 sons were still children. One day the 2 boys came with their bows to the great smith Wayland, asking him to make arrows for them. "Not today," the smith answered. "I have not time, and besides, even though you are the sons of the king, I may not work for you without the wish and consent of your father. If he is willing, you may come again, but you must promise to do exactly as I tell you." "What is that?" one of the boys ventured. "You must," said Wayland, "come on a day when snow has freshly fallen, and you must walk facing backward all the way." The children cared little whether they walked backward or forward, as long as they got their arrows, and so they promised. To their delight, next morning they found that snow had fallen. Quickly they set out for the smithy, walking backward all the way. "Oh, Wayland, make us the arrows," they cried. "The king, our father, has said that we might have them." But Wayland had no intention of making the arrows, for the king had treated him unjustly and cruelly, and he saw the opportunity for revenge. With his mighty hammer he struck the 2 children on the head and killed them. Then he threw their bodies into a cave adjoining the smithy. When the children did not return, the castle messengers were sent out to find them. They inquired at the smithy. "The boys have gone," said Wayland. "I made arrows for them, and no doubt they have gone into the woods to shoot birds." Returning to the castle, the messengers saw the footprints in the snow, and since they pointed toward home, decided that the children must have gone back. But they were not there. Then Nidung sent his servants far and wide throughout the country, and when the boys were nowhere to be found, he concluded that they must have been devoured by wild animals. When all the searches were over, Wayland brought forth the bodies of the 2 children, stripped the bones of flesh, whitened them, and made them into goblets and vessels for the king's table, mounting them with silver and gold. The king was delighted with them, and had them placed upon his board whenever there were guests of honor present. A long time later, Badhild, the king's daughter, while playing with her companions in the garden one day, broke a costly ring that Nidung had given her. She was greatly vexed, and feared to tell her father. "Why not take it to Wayland to mend?" suggested one of her trusted maidens. So Badhild gave the trinket to the girl and bade her take it to Wayland. She brought it back with her. "Without the command of the king he will not mend it," she said, "unless the king's daughter herself will come to him." Badhild set out immediately for the smithy. There Wayland substituted for her ring his own, which had the curious magic power of making its wearer fall in love with the smith. The smith slipped the jewel on her finger, gazed into her eyes, and said, "This ring you shall keep as well as your own, if you will be my bride." The maiden could not refuse, and so the 2 were married, agreeing to keep their union a secret. About this time Egil, the brother of Wayland, came to the court of Nidung. He was a celebrated man, and the most skilful master of the bow to be found anywhere in the world. The king welcomed him, and he remained a long time at the court. One day Nidung proposed that, since he was such a skilful bowman, he should try shooting an apple from the head of his own son. Egil agreed. "You may have only one trial," the king said. So an apple was placed on the head of Egil's 3-year-old son, and Egil, taking his bow, aimed and with the first arrow struck the apple in the centre, so that it fell from the child's head. "Why did you have 3 arrows?" the king asked. "Sire," replied Egil, "I will not lie to you. If I had pierced my son with the first arrow, the other 2 would have pierced you." The king, strange to say, did not take offence at this speech, but on the contrary showed Egil still greater favour than he had in the past. The archer frequently visited his brother Wayland, but Badhild came but seldom to her husband's house. One day the 2 came together at Wayland's special request. When they were leaving, Wayland embraced Badhild and said to her, "You will be the mother of a boy, your child and mine. It may be that I shall go away from here and never see his face, but you must tell him that I have made for him worthy weapons, and stowed them in safety in the place where the water enters and the wind goes out, the forge." The next time Wayland saw Egil, he bade him bring to him all kinds of feathers, large and small. "I wish to make for myself a doublet of feathers," he explained. Then Egil shot many birds of prey and brought their feathers to Wayland. From them he made a flying shirt, clad in which he looked more like an eagle than a man. Egil admired the workmanship, and Wayland asked him to try it. "How shall I rise? How fly, and how alight?" asked Egil. "You must rise against the wind, and fly first low and then high, but you must alight with the wind." Egil did as he was told, and he had a good deal of trouble in alighting. Finally he knocked his head with such force on the ground that he lost consciousness. When he came to himself, Wayland spoke. "Tell me, brother Egil, do you like the shirt?" "If it were as easy to alight as it is to fly," was the answer, "I should fly away and you would never see me again." "I will alter what is wrong," said the smith, making a slight change in the shirt. Then, with Egil's help, he put on the feathers, flapped his wings, and rose into the air. He lighted on a turret of the castle, and called down to Egil, "I did not tell you the truth when I said that you should alight with the wind, for I knew that if you found out how easy it was to fly, you would never give me the shirt back again. You can see for yourself that all birds rise against the wind, and alight in the same way. I am going home to my own country, but first I must have a few words with Nidung. And remember, if he bids you shoot me, shoot under the left wing, for there I have fastened a bladder filled with blood." With these words Wayland flew to the highest tower of the king's castle, and called to the king as he passed with his courtiers. "Are you a bird, Wayland?" asked the king. "Sometimes I am a bird, and sometimes a man," was the reply. "But now I am going away from here, and never again will you have me in your power. Listen while I speak. You promised once to give me your daughter and the half of your kingdom, but you made of me instead an outcast, because I defended myself, and killed the wretches who would have taken my life. You surprised me while I slept, and stole my arms and my treasures. And not satisfied with that,
19,
you laid a net for my
Twardowski,
feet, and made of me a
Faust.
cripple. But I have had my
Toward the
revenge.
close of the 18th century,
Do you know where
it
your
was pointed
sons
out to
are?
visitors in the
My
old town of
sons,
Krakow,
cried Nidung.
the house
Oh,
of the
tell me
magician
what you know of
Twardowski,
them.
who
I will
quite
tell
properly
you,
was
but
called
first you must
the
swear
Faust
to
of
me by the
Poland,
deck of the ship
because of
and
his
the edge of
dealings
the
with
shield,
the evil one.
by the back of the horse and
In
the
his
blade
youth,
of the sword,
Twardowski had
that
followed
you
the
will
study
do
of
no
medicine,
harm
and
to
with
my
such
wife and
industry
child.
and such eagerness
Nidung
and such
swore,
a clear
and
mind
Wayland
did he
began
practice
his speech.
profession, that it was not
Go
long
to the
before he
smithy,
was the most
and there in the
celebrated
cave
doctor
you will
in
find the
all
remains
Poland.
of your sons.
But
I killed
Twardowski
them,
was not
and
satisfied
of their
with this.
bones made
He
vessels for
craved
your
greater
table.
and still greater power.
Your daughter Badhild is my wife.
At last, one day,
So I
as he
have
was
repaid
reading,
evil
he
with
found
evil,
in an old
and our
book of
connection
magic
is ended.
that for which he had long
With
been
these
seeking,
words he flew
the
away.
formula for
while
summoning
Nidung
the
with great
devil.
anger cried, "Egil,
When
shoot
night
at
came, a storm
Wayland."
had risen, but
"I
caring
cannot
not
harm
for
my own
that,
brother,"
he
replied
hurried away
Egil.
to the lonely mountain
"Shoot,"
Kremenki.
cried the king, "or I will
There,
kill
in a
you."
rudely constructed
Then
hut,
Egil laid an
he
arrow
began
in his bow and
incantations.
shot Wayland as he had been instructed,
Before
under
long,
his
there was
left
an
arm,
earthquake. Great
until the
rocks
blood
were
flowed,
loosened, the
and
ground
everyone
opened
thought
at
that the great
Twardowski's
smith had
feet, and
received his
flames
death
leaped
wound.
out.
But
And in the
Wayland,
flames
unharmed,
appeared
flew
the
away
evil
to
one
Zealand
himself,
and made his
in the
home
form of a
there in
man,
his father's
clad
land.
in a red cloak and the
Nidung,
well-known pointed
meantime,
red cap.
was sad and unhappy, and
"What
it
do
was
you
not
wish?"
long before he
the devil
died, and
asked.
Otvin, his son,
"The
succeeded to
power
the
of your
throne.
most secret wisdom,"
Otvin
the
was
answer.
soon loved and honoured
"And
throughout
how
the
is
kingdom
this to be
because of
done?
his great justice and
"You shall
kindness.
make me the most celebrated
sister
of all
lived with
learned
him
men
at
of the
court,
century,
and
and
there
shall
her son,
besides give me
Widge,
such
was
happiness
born.
as no man
One
has
day
ever
Wayland
enjoyed
sent
upon
messengers
this
to
earth
Otvin,
before."
asking for peace and pardon,
"So be it,"
and when
said
these
the
were
devil,
granted, he travelled
"but
again
on
to
condition that
Jutland,
at the end
and
of
was
7
received
years,
with great
I
honour.
gain possession of your soul."
The mighty smith was very glad to
"You
see
may
his
take
wife
me,"
again,
answered
and very
Twardowski,
proud of his
"but
3-year-old
only in
son.
Rome may you have power
But
over
he would
me.
not yield to
Thither at the
Otvin's
end of
request
7
that he
years
remain
will
in
I go."
Jutland. Instead, he
The
returned to
devil
Zealand
hesitated
with
over this
Badhild
clause,
and Widge,
but thinking
and
of
there
the
they
fun he
lived
could have
happily
in the
for
holy
many
city,
years.
finally agreed.
Wayland was known
Leaning
throughout
against
all the
wall
world
of
for his
stone, he
knowledge
wrote
and
the
skill,
compact, which
and his son
Twardowski,
Widge
making
was a
slight
powerful
wound
hero,
in his arm,
whose praises were
signed
much
with his
celebrated
own
in
blood.
song. So
When
ends the story
Twardowski
of
descended
Wayland,
from the
the
mountain and
great
made
smith
his way,
of the
book
northern
under arms,
countries.
through the valley, he
End
heard the bells
of
in all
chapter
the towers of
18.
the city ringing out clearly and solemnly on the still night air. He listened, wondering at the unaccustomed noise, then hurried into the town, inquiring from everyone he met what the occasion was. But no one seemed to have heard the sound. Then a deep feeling of sadness came over him as he realized the meaning of the bells. They were the funeral knell of his own soul. When morning came, however, doubts were forgotten, and Twardowski was glad to have the devil at his command. The first thing that he demanded was to have all the silver of Poland gathered together in one place and covered over with a great mound of sand. Similar requests followed, and it was not long before the devil repented of his bargain. One day it would please Twardowski to fly without wings through the air. On another, to the delight of the crowd, to gallop backward on a cock. On another, to float in a boat without a rudder or sail, accompanied by some maiden who for the moment had inflamed his heart. One day, by the use of his magic mirror, he set fire to the castle of an enemy a mile away. This last feat made him greatly feared by people far and wide. At last, the 7 years were up. The devil appeared to Twardowski and said, "Twardowski, the time of our pact is over, and I command you to fulfill your promise and go to Rome." "What shall I do there?" "Give me your immortal soul," was the answer. "Do you think I'm a fool?" asked Twardowski. "You gave me your promise to go to Rome after 7 years. "That I have already done," said Twardowski, "and I did not promise to stay in Rome." "Noble deceiver!" exclaimed the evil one. "Stupid devil!" cried Twardowski. Then, after a struggle, the devil vanished, and Twardowski returned home. For over a year he pored incessantly over his books of magic, until at last he found a formula for warding off death. Then he called his disciple Famulus to him, and explained that he was going to test the formula. "You have always obliged me without question," said Twardowski, "and I expect you to now. Take this knife and thrust it into my heart." "God forbid!" cried Famulus. "Why are you frightened? I know what I am doing. Take the knife and kill me, as the parchment directs." "I cannot." "You must," insisted Twardowski. "It's impossible." "No more exclamations. Do as I tell you." "Oh, oh, oh," wailed Famulus. "Strike," thundered Twardowski, "or I will kill you this instant." Then Famulus did as he was bid and forced the blade into his master's heart. Twardowski uttered a low cry, fell, and was soon dead. Famulus dropped trembling into a chair and covered his face with his hands. Then he remembered that he must read the remainder of the parchment in order to find out what he must do to restore the body to life. Then he set about the task, severed the limbs of the dead body, and worked and brewed and distilled until the elixir described in the parchment was prepared. With the elixir he rubbed the members of the master's body, put them together, and laid the corpse in a coffin. This he buried on the following night, explaining to Twardowski's friends that such had been the master's wish. Now the parchment stated that the body must remain in the grave 7 years, 7 months, 7 days, and 7 hours. So Famulus could do nothing but wait. At last the time had expired, and on a snowy, cold December night he found his way to the grave. He dug out the coffin, brushed off the snow and earth, opened the casket, and found not the body of Twardowski, but that of a child who lay sleeping in a bed of fragrant violets. The child is like Twardowski, Famulus thought, and he gathered him up under his cloak and carried him home. The next morning the child was the size of a 12-year-old, and after 7 weeks he was a full-grown man. Twardowski, who now seemed quite himself, only younger and stronger, thanked Famulus and resumed again his study of magic. He desired above all things to be freed forever from his compact with the devil. This, he read in one of the books, he might do if he would brave the terrors of the underworld. So Twardowski determined to enter the gates of hell. At his magic speech, the ground opened and he began the path of descent. Blue flames lighted the way. Deeper and deeper he went through dark and winding passages. At last he reached the underworld itself, and many awful sights did he behold. And the farther he went, the more frightened did he become. He could not help feeling that the devil had plotted something against him. Finally, he found himself in a small room, and cast a hasty glance around, looking for means of escape. Seeing a child in a cradle in one corner of the room, he seized it hastily, threw his cloak around it, and was about to leave when the door opened, and the evil one entered. He made a respectful bow and said, "Will you be good enough to go with me now?" "Why so?" asked Twardowski obstinately. "Because of our agreement." "But," said the magician, "only in Rome have you power over me." "Yes," replied the devil, "and Rome is the name of this house. You think to trick me by a pun, but you cannot. I carry this talisman of innocence," and throwing aside his cloak, he disclosed the sleeping child. Anger showed in the face of the devil, but he stepped nearer to Twardowski and said softly, "What are you thinking of, Twardowski? Have you forgotten your promise? The nobleman's word is sacred to him." Pride awoke in the breast of the magician. "I must keep my word," he said, laying the child back in his crib and surrendering himself. On the shoulders of the devil 2 wings appeared, like the wings of a bat. He seized Twardowski and flew away with him, mounting higher and higher into the night. The magician was so terrified and suffered such anguish in the clutches of the evil one that in a few moments he was changed into an old man. But he did not lose consciousness. At last, so high were they that cities appeared like flies, and Krakow, with its mighty turrets, like 2 spiders. Deeply moved, Twardowski looked down upon the scene of all his struggles and all his joys. But higher and higher they went, higher than any eagle has ever flown, and more lonely and more fearful did it seem to Twardowski. Only occasionally bright stars passed by them, or fiery meteors, leaving a long streak of light behind. At last they came to the moon, which stared at them with dead eyes. Then a song that Twardowski had read in his mother's hymn book rose to his lips. And as he repeated mechanically the prayer his mother had taught him, an angel suddenly appeared and said, "Satan, let Twardowski go. And you, Twardowski, hang you there between heaven and earth, to atone for your sin until the last judgment. Then will you be reunited with your mother in heaven. The prayer which you remembered in your hour of need has saved you." And so, according to the story, Twardowski is suspended in the vault of heaven to this very day. End of chapter 19. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman.
Chapter 20. Ilia Muromec of Russia. When we think of Russia, we think of a great dark country, a country of long winters and abundant snow and ice. It was here long ago, in the city of Kiev, that the hero Ilia Muromec was born. There was at that time a great castle in the city, and this was well protected by Ilia Muromec and his 12 armed knights. For 30 long years had they kept watch at their post, and no stranger had ever passed by them. But one morning Dobrnya, the night after Ilia Muromec, most powerful, perceived on the ground the imprint of a horse's hoof. Then he said to the knights, "Now is the mighty Ziedovian in the neighbourhood of our castle. What is your will?" The knights with one accord agreed that Dobrnya should ride out against the stranger. So Dobrnya mounted his war horse and galloped forth to meet Ziedovian, calling to him in a deep, gruff voice, "Hear my insolence, sir. You have come all the way to our castle and have omitted to send greeting to our captain Ilia Muromec, or to inform him of your approach." When Ziedovian heard these words, he turned quickly and rode towards Dobrnya with such force that springs and lakes appeared wherever the hoofs of his black horse touched the ground, and the trembling of the earth caused great waves to rise on the sea. Dobrnya was so frightened that he jerked his horse about, and with swiftness of the cyclone galloped back to the castle. When he entered, almost exhausted, he told in great excitement of his encounter. Immediately Ilia decided to go forth himself against the enemy, and all the entreaties of his knights could not restrain him. So he rode out to a high point where he could see Ziedovian, watch him as he threw his 100-weight club into the clouds, caught it with one hand and swung it around in the air as if it had been a feather. Then Ilia spurred his horse and rode towards Ziedovian. A horrible fight ensued. Swords crashed and deep fissures were made in the earth, but neither knight fell. It seemed as if both heroes had grown fast to their saddles, so unshakable were they. At last they jumped from their horses and fought hand to hand with lances. All day long and all night long they struggled, until Ilia finally fell wounded to the ground. Ziedovian kneeled on his breast, drew out his sharp knife, and was about to cut off the head of his enemy. Ilia meantime was thinking, "Surely the Holy Fathers did not lie to me when they said that I should not lose my life in battle." Then suddenly he felt his strength redoubled, and he hurled Ziedovian from him with such force that his body touched the clouds before it fell again in the moist earth at his feet. Cutting off the warrior's head, he mounted his horse and rode back to the castle. To his knights he said, 30 years have I ridden in the field, and 30 years have I fought with heroes and tested my strength. But such a mighty man as Ziedovian have I in all that time never met. End of chapter 20. Recording by Andy from Inverarnon, melys.ws.
Kralewitz Marko of Servia. Kralewitz Marko was the son of a Servian king who lived many, many years ago. He was very fond of hunting, and one day he rode forth on his horse Servia to the mountain Sargao. Being tired, he dismounted, tied his horse to a tree, sat down in its shade, and fell asleep. And as he slept, it happened that Arbanes Nida with his 7 brothers rode by. They all dismounted, lifted Kralewitz, bound him to his horse, and rode away with him to Jedrina, where they presented him to the vizier. Highly pleased over the gift, the vizier took the king's son and threw him into prison. 2 long years Kralewitz lay there, longing for liberty and home. Then he learned that in a few days he was to be executed. Immediately he wrote a letter to his friend Milos Obilis, asking for help. This important message he entrusted to his only companion, a white falcon. Tying the letter under the bird's wing, he set it free. The falcon easily found its way, alighted on Milos's window, and was admitted. Scarcely had Milos read the letter when he and 2 of his friends were ready to set out for Jedrina. They reached there the day before the execution. In the morning the gate of the city was opened, and Marko was led out. Milos and his companions accompanied the mournful procession to an open field in which the execution was to take place. 2 Arabs stood up with gleaming swords, prepared to cut off Markos's head. "Hold on, brothers," cried Milos. "I will give you a sharper sword with which to cut off the malicious head of the noble Priam. See, with this sword did the good-for-nothing treacherously slay my father. Cursed be his hand." With these words he rushed to Markos's side. Then with one swift stroke he cut off the head of one Arab, and with another the head of the other. With still another stroke he severed the chains that bound Marko, and Marko, seizing a sword, swung himself into his saddle, and with his friends began to attack the horde of Turks. Frightened, the Turks fled before them, and Marko and his companions returned to their own country. Marko waited for and soon found the opportunity of showing his gratitude to his friend, for Milos and 2 of his brothers were thrown into prison in Varadin. Milos wrote with his own blood a letter to Marko, asking for help. Then the king's son sprang to his horse Servia and rode to Varadin. Outside of the city he dismounted, stuck his spear in the earth, tied Servia, and began drinking the black wine which he had brought with him. He poured it into huge beakers, half of which he drank himself, and half of which he gave to Servia. At the same time a beautiful maiden, the daughter-in-law of the general, passed by. When she saw the king's son, she was frightened and ran and told her father-in-law. Then the general sent out his son Velimir with 300 men to take Marko prisoner. The knights encircled Kralewitz Marko, but he continued drinking his wine and paid no attention to them. But Servia noticed them, and drawing near, her master began beating the ground with her hoofs. At this Marko looked up and saw himself surrounded. He emptied his beaker, threw it to the ground, and sprang to his horse. Like a falcon among doves, Marko charged against the enemy. He cut off the heads of some and drove the rest before him into the Danube. Velimir tried to flee, but Marko threw him from his horse, tied his hands and feet, and bound him to Servia. Then again he began to drink his wine. All this the maiden watched and reported to her father. He gathered together 3,000 knights and rode forth against the stranger. They surrounded Marko, but he was undismayed. Bravely he charged against them, his sword in his right hand, his spear in his left, and the reins held between his teeth. every knight he touched with either sword or spear fell instantly to the ground. And when Vuca the general, wholly dismayed, tried to escape on his fiery Arabian horse, Marko followed him, threw him, bound him, and led him to the palace where his son lay. Then he bound the two together, tossed them on the saddle of the Arabian horse, and rode home. There he put them in prison. Hearing this, the wife of the general wrote a letter to Marko, begging for mercy for her husband and son. Marko promised to release them on condition that she release Milos and his brothers. This she did, honouring them and making them rich presents. "Now, for the love of heaven," said she, "see that my husband and my son return to me." "Never fear," answered Milos. "Give me the general's black horse, adorn him as the general adorned him. Give me a golden chariot with 12 horses, such as the general rides in when he journeys to the emperor in Vienna, and give me the robe that the general wears on state occasions." The wife provided all that he asked, and gave the prisoners for themselves 1,000 ducats. Then they rode away. Marko welcomed them, released the general and his son, and provided them with a strong bodyguard back to Varadin. Then Milos and his brothers divided the ducats among them, kissed the hand of the king's son, and rode away into their own country. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22. The Decision of Libuscha. There dwelt once in the neighbourhood of Grönberg Castle in Bohemia 2 brothers, Stagwulf and Chrudis, of the distinguished family of Klomovita, and these 2 had fallen into a fierce dispute over the inheritance of their father's lands. The oldest son, Chrudis, thought that he should inherit all of the estate, and that is the custom in some countries, you know, while the younger son, Stagwulf, declared that the property should be equally divided. Now, it happened that a sister of the Princess Libuscha, Viched, lived in the court. She entreated the princess to settle the quarrel according to law. The princess yielded to her wish, and decided that the brothers should inherit either their father's estate jointly or divide it into equal shares. All the lords of the country assembled to hear the rendering of the decision, brave knights from far and near. Chrudis and Stagwulf, of course, were present, very curious to hear what their princess would decide. Pungel of Hadio, proclaimed far and wide as the bravest of all the knights of Bohemia, was also among the company. The princess herself rendered the decision, standing in white robes before her people. The 2 brothers stood near, and scarcely had the last word been uttered when the knight Chrudis, who, as firstborn, claimed the estate for himself, sprang excitedly to his feet, mocking and insulting the princess. "Poor people," he said, addressing the assembly, "I am sorry for you, who have to be ruled over by a girl." Deeply grieved, the maiden Princess Libuscha arose, explaining that she would no longer rule alone. She commanded the people to choose her a husband. "No matter whom you choose," she declared, "I will abide by your decision." Thereupon the assembled subjects cried out that they would have Pungel of Hadio as prince, and Libuscha, stepping towards him, extended her hand to him in token of her arrangement. Thus did Pungel become the liege lord of the Bohemian nobles. No one knows how long ago all this happened, for the manuscript that tells the story was very old when it was discovered in the year 1817. It had laid for many, many years among other old documents in the great chests that line the walls of the courtroom in the ancient castle Grönberg in Bohemia. The manuscript is now in a great museum in Prague, and perhaps someday, when you go there, you will see it for yourself. End of chapter 22.
Count Roland of France. The trumpet sounded, and the army went on its way to France. The next day, King Charles called his lords together. "You see," said he, "these narrow passes. Whom shall I place to command the rearguard. Choose a man yourselves. Said Ganelon, whom should we choose but my son-in-law, Count Roland? You have no man in your host so valiant. Of a truth he will be the salvation of France. The king said when he heard these words, What ails you, Ganelon? You look like to one possessed. When Count Roland knew what was proposed concerning him, he spake out, as a true knight should speak. I am right thankful to you, father-in-law, that you have caused me to put in this place. Of truth, the king of France shall lose nothing by my means, neither charger, nor mule, nor pack-horse, nor beast of burden. Then Roland turned to the king, and said, Give me 20,000 only, so they be men of valour, and I will keep the passes in all safety. So long as I shall live, you need not fear no man. Then Roland mounted his horse. With him were Oliver, his comrade, and Otho and Berenger, and Gerard of Roussillon, an aged warrior, and others, men of renown. And Turpin the archbishop cried, By my head I will go also. So they chose 20,000 warriors with whom to keep the passes. Meanwhile King Charles had entered the valley of Roncesvalles. High were the mountains on either side of the way, and the valleys were gloomy and dark. But when the army had passed through the valley, they saw the fair land of Gascony, and as they saw it, thought of their homes and their wives and daughters. There was not one of them but wept for the tenderness of heart. But of all that company there were none sadder than the king himself, when he thought how he had left his nephew, Count Roland, behind him in the passes of Spain. And now the Saracen king, Marcellus, began to gather his army. He laid a strict command on all his nobles and chiefs that they should bring with them to Saragossa as many men as they could gather together. And when they came to the city, it being the 3rd day from the issuing of the king's command, they saluted the great image of Mahomet, false prophet, that stood on the topmost tower. This done, they went forth from the city gates. They made all haste, marching across the mountains and valleys of Spain, till they came in sight of the standard of France, where Roland and Oliver and the 12 peers were ranged in battle array. The Saracen champions donned their coats of mail, of double substance most of them, and they sat upon their heads helmets of Saragossa, of well-tempered metal, and they girded themselves with swords of Vienna. Fair were their shields to view, their lances were from Valentia, their standards were of white, blue, and red. Their mules they left with the servants, and mounted their chargers, so moved forward. Fair was the day, and bright the sun, as their armour flashed in the light, and the drums were beaten so loudly that the Frenchmen heard the sound. Said Oliver to Roland, Comrade, methinks we shall soon do battle with the Saracens. God grant it, answered Roland. 'Tis our duty to hold the place of the king, and we will do it, come what may. As for me, I will not set an ill example. Oliver climbed to the top of the hill, and saw from thence the whole army of the heathen. He cried to Roland his companion, I see the flashing of arms. The men of France shall have no small trouble therefrom. This is the doing of Ganelon the traitor. Be silent, answered Roland, till you shall know. Say no more about him. Oliver looked again from the hilltop, and saw how the Saracens came on. So many there were that he could not count their battalions. He descended to the plain with all speed, and came to the array of the French, and said, I have seen more heathen than man ever yet saw together upon the earth. There are 100,000 at the least. We shall have such a battle with them as never before been fought. My brethren of France, quit you like men. Be strong. Stand firm that you not be conquered. And all the army shouted with one voice, Cursed be he that shall fly. Then Oliver turned to Roland and said, Sound your horn, my friend. Charles will hear it, and will return. I were a fool, answered Roland, so to do. Not so, but I will deal these heathen some mighty blows with Durendal, my sword. They have been ill-advised to venture into these passes. I swear that they are condemned to death, one and all. After a while, Oliver said again, Friend Roland, sound your horn of ivory, then will the king return, and bring his army with them to our help. But Roland answered again, I will not do dishonour to my kinsmen, nor to the fair land of France. I have my sword, that shall suffice for me. These evil-minded heathen are gathered together against us, to their own hurt. Surely not one of them shall escape from death. As for me, said Oliver, I see not where the dishonour would be. I saw the valleys and the mountains covered with the great multitude of Saracens. Theirs is, in truth, a mighty array, and we are but few. So much the better, answered Roland. It makes my courage grow. 'Tis better to die than to be disgraced. And remember, the harder our blows, the more the king will love us. Roland was brave, but Oliver was wise. Consider, he said, comrade, these enemies are over near to us, and the king over far. Were he here, he would not be in danger, but there are some here today who will never fight in another battle. Then Turpin the archbishop struck spurs into his horse and rode to a hilltop. Then he turned to the men of France and spake, Lords of France, King Charles has left us here. Our king he is, and it is our duty to die for him. Today our Christian faith is in peril. Do ye fight for it? Fight ye must. But be sure of that, for there, under your eyes, are the Saracens. Confess, therefore, your sins, and pray to God that he have mercy upon you. And now for your soul's health, I will give you all absolution. If you die, you will be God's martyrs, every one of you, and your places are ready for you in his paradise. Thereupon the men of France dismounted, and knelt upon the ground, and the archbishop blessed them in God's name. But look, he said, I set you a penance. Smite these pagans. Then the men of France rose to their feet. They had received absolution, and they were set free from all their sins, and the archbishop had blessed them in the name of God. After this they mounted their swift steeds, and clad themselves in armour, and made themselves ready for the battle. Said Roland to Oliver, Brother, you know that it is Ganelon who has betrayed us. Good store he has had of gold and silver as a reward. 'Tis the king, Marcellus, that has made merchandise of us. But verily, it is with our swords that he shall be paid. So saying, he rode unto the pass, mounted on his good steed, Valantif. His spear he held, with the point to the sky. A white flag it bore with the fringes of gold which fell down to his hands. A stalwart man was he, and his countenance was fair and smiling. Behind him followed Oliver, his friend, and the men of France pointed to him, saying, See our champion! Pride was in his eye when he looked towards the Saracens. But to the men of France his regard was all sweetness and humility. Full courtesy he spake to them. Ride not so fast, my lords, he said. Verily these heathens are come hither seeking martyrdom. 'Tis a fair spoil that we shall gather from them today. Never has King of France gained any so rich. And as he spake, the two hosts came together. Said Oliver, You did not deem it fit, my lord, to sound your horn. Therefore you lack the help which the king would have sent. Not his the blame, for he knows nothing of what has chanced. But do you, lords of France, charge as fiercely as you may, and yield not one whit to the enemy. Think upon these two things only, how to deal a straight blow and how to take it. And let us not forget King Charles's cry of battle. Then all the men of France with one voice cried out, Mountjoy! He that heard them so cry had never doubted that they were men of valour. Proud was their array as they rode on to battle, spurring their horses that they might speed them more. And the Saracens on their part came forward with a good heart. Thus did the Frenchman and the heathen meet in the shock of battle. Full many of the heathen warriors fell that day. Not one of the 12 peers of France but slew his man. But of all none bore himself so valiantly as Roland. Many a blow did he deal to the enemy with his mighty spear, and when the spear was shivered in his hand, 15 warriors having fallen before it, then he seized the good sword Durendal, and smote man after man to the ground. Red was he with the blood of his enemies. Red was his hauberk, red his arms, red his shoulders, aye, and the neck of his horse. Not one of the 12 lingered in the rear, or was slow to strike. But Count Roland was the bravest of the brave. Well done, sons of France, cried Turpin the archbishop, when he saw them lay on in such sort. Next to Roland, for valour and hardihood, came Oliver, his companion. Many a heathen warrior did he slay, till at last his spear was shivered in his hand. What are you doing, comrade? Cried Roland, when he was aware of the mishap. A man wants no staff in such a battle as this. 'Tis the steel and nothing else that he must have. Where is your sword, Hautclere, with its hilt of gold and its pommel of crystal? On my word, said Oliver, I have not had time to draw it. I was so busy with striking. But as he spake, he drew the good sword from its scabbard, and smote a heathen knight. Justin of the Iron Valley, a mighty blow it was, cleaving the man in twain down to his saddle. Ay, and the saddle itself, with the adorning of gold and jewels, and the very backbone also of the steed whereupon he rode, so that horse and man fell dead together on the plains. Well done, cried Roland. You are a true brother of mine. 'Tis such strokes as this that make the king love us. Nevertheless, for all the valour of Roland and his fellows, the battle went hard with the men of France. Many lances were shivered, many flags torn, and many gallant youths cut off in their prime. Nevermore would see mother and wife. It was the ill deed that the traitor Ganelon wrought when he sold his fellows to King Marcellus. And now there befell a new trouble. King Almaris, with a great host of heathen, coming up by an unknown way, fell upon the rear of the host, where there was another pass. Fiercely did the noble Walter that kept the same charge the newcomers, but they outpowered him and his followers. He was wounded with 4 several lances, and 4 times did he swoon, so that at last he was constrained to leave the field of battle, that he might call the Count Roland to his aid. But small was the aid which Roland could give him, or anyone. Valiantly he held up the battle, and with him Oliver and Turpin the Archbishop, and others also. But the lines of the men of France were broken, and their armour thrust through, and their spears shivered, and their flags trodden in the dust. For all this they made such slaughter among the heathen, that King Almaris, who led the armies of the enemy, scarcely could win back his way to his own people, wounded in 4 places and sorely spent. A right good warrior was he, had he but been a Christian, but few had matched him in battle. Count Roland saw how grievously his people had suffered, and spake thus to Oliver his comrade. Dear comrade, you see how many brave men lie dead upon the ground. Well, may we mourn for fair France, widowed as she is of so many valiant champions. But why is our king not here? O Oliver, my brother, what shall we do to send him tidings of our state? I know not, answered Oliver. Only this I know, that death is to be chosen rather than dishonour. And after a while, King Roland said again, I shall blow my horn. King Charles will hear it, where he has encamped beyond the passes, and he and his host will come back. That would be ill done, answered Oliver, and shame both you and your race. When I give you this counsel, you would have none of it. Now I like it not. 'Tis not for a brave man to sound the horn and cry for help now that we are in such case. The battle is too hard for us, said Roland again, and I shall sound my horn that the king may hear. And Oliver answered again, When I gave you this counsel you scorned it. Now I myself like it not. 'Tis true that had the king been here, he had not suffered this loss. But blame is not his. 'Tis your folly, Count Roland, that has done to death all these men of France. But for that we should have conquered in this battle, and have taken and slain King Marcellus. But now we can do nothing for France and the king. We can but die. Woe is me for our country, aye, and for our friendship, which will come to grievous end this day. The Archbishop perceived that the 2 friends were at variance, and spurred his horse till he came where they stood. Listen to me, he said, Sir Roland and Sir Oliver, I implore you not to fall out with each other in this fashion. We, sons of France, that are in this place, are of a truth condemned to death. Neither will the sounding of your horn save us, for the king is far away, and cannot come in time. Nevertheless, I hold it to be well that you should sound it. When the king and his army shall come, they will find us dead. That I know full well. But they will avenge us, so that our enemies shall not go away rejoicing, and they will also recover our bodies, and will carry them away for burial in holy places, so that the dogs and wolves shall not devour them. You say well, cried Roland, and he put his horn to his lips, and gave so mighty a blast upon it that the sound was heard 30 leagues away. King Charles and his men heard it, and the king said, Our countrymen are fighting with the enemy. But Ganelon answered, Sire, had any but you so spoken, I had said that he spoke falsely. Then Roland blew his horn a second time. With great pain and anguish of body he blew it, and the red blood gushed from his lips. but the sound was heard yet farther than the first. Again the king heard it, and all his nobles and all his men. That, said he, is Roland's horn. He never had sounded it were he not in battle with the enemy. But Ganelon answered again, Believe me, sire, there is no battle. You are an old man, and you have the fancies of a child. You know what a mighty man of valour is this Roland. Think you that anyone would dare to attack him? No one of a truth. Ride on, sire. Why halt you here? The fair land of France is yet far away. Roland blew his horn a third time, and when the king heard it, he said, He that blew that horn drew a deep breath, and King Names cried out, Roland is in trouble. On my conscience he is fighting with the enemy. Someone has betrayed him. 'Tis he, no doubt, that would deceive you now. To arms, sire. Utter your war cry, and help your own house and your country. You have heard the cry of the noble Roland. Then King Charles bade all the trumpets sound, and forthwith all the men of France armed themselves with helmets and hauberks, and swords with pommels of gold. Mighty were their shields, and their lances strong, and the flags they carried were white and red and blue. And when they made an end of their arming, they rode back with all haste. There was not one of them but said to his comrade, If we find Roland yet alive, what a mighty stroke we will strike for him. But Ganelon the king handed over to the knaves of his kitchen. Take this traitor, he said, who has sold his country. Ill did Ganelon fare among them. They pulled out his hair and his beard, and smote him with their staves. Then they put a great chain, such as that with which a bear is bound, about his neck, and made him fast to a pack-horse. This done, the king and his army hastened with all speed to the help of Roland. In the van and the rear sounded the trumpets, as though they would answer Roland's horn. Full of wrath was King Charles as he rode. Full of wrath were all the men of France. There was not one among them but wept and sobbed. There was not one but prayed. Now may God keep Roland alive till we come to the battlefield, so that we may strike a blow for him. Alas, it was all in vain. They could not come in time for all their speed. Count Roland looked around on the mountain sides and on the plains. Alas, how many noble sons of France he saw lying dead upon them. Dear friends, he said, weeping as he spoke, may God have mercy on you and receive you into his paradise. More loyal followers have I never seen. How is the fair land of France widowed at her bravest, and I can give you no help. Oliver, dear comrade, we must not part. If the enemy slay me not here, surely I will be slain by sorrow. Come then, let us smite these heathen. Thus did Roland again charge the enemy, his good sword Durendal in his hand. As the stag flies before the hounds, so did the heathen fly before Roland. By my faith, cried the archbishop when he saw them, that is a right good knight. Such courage, and such a steed, and such arms I love well to see. If a man be not brave and a stouter fighter, he had better by far be a monk in some cloister where he may pray all day long for our sins. Now the heathen, when they saw how few the Frenchmen were, took fresh courage, and the Caliph, spurring his horse, rode against Oliver and smote him in the middle of his back, making his spear pass right through him. That is a shrewd blow, he cried. I have avenged my friends and countrymen upon you. Then Oliver knew he was stricken to death, but he would not fall unavenged. With his great sword, Hautclere, he smote the Caliph on the head and cleft it to the teeth. Curse you, pagan! Neither your wife nor any woman in the land of your birth shall boast that you have taken a penny's worth from King Charles. But to Roland he cried, Come, comrade, help me. Well I know that we two shall part in great sorrow this day. Roland came with all speed and saw his friend, how he lay all pale and fainting on the ground, and how the blood gushed in great streams from his wound. I know not what to do, he cried. This is an ill chance that has befallen you. Truly, France is bereaved of her bravest son. So saying, he went near to swoon in the saddle as he sat. Then there befell a strange thing. Oliver had lost so much of his blood that he could not any more see clearly or know who it was that was near him. So he raised up his arm and smote with all his strength that yet remained to him on the helmet of Roland his friend. The helmet he cleft in twain to the visor, but by good fortune it wounded not the head. Roland looked at him and said in a gentle voice, "Did you this of set purpose? I am Roland your friend, and have not harmed you." "Ah," said Oliver, "I hear you speak, but I cannot see you. Pardon me that I struck you. It was not done of set purpose." "It harmed me not," answered Roland. "With all my heart, and before God I forgive you." And this was the way these two friends parted at last. And now Oliver felt the pains of death come over him. He could no longer see nor hear. Therefore he turned his thoughts to making his peace with God, and clasping his hands lifted them to heavens and made his confession. "O Lord," he said, "take me to paradise, and do thou bless King Charles and the sweet land of France." And when he had said thus he died, and Roland looked at him as he lay. There was not upon earth a more sorrowful man than he. "Dear comrade," he said, "this is indeed an evil day. Many a year have we two been together. Never have I done wrong to you. Never have you done wrong to me. How shall I bear to live without you?" And he swooned where he sat on his horse, but the stirrup held him up that he did not fall to the ground. When Roland came to himself, he looked about him and saw how great was the calamity that had befallen his army. For now there were left alive to him two only, Turpin the Archbishop and Walter of Hum. Walter had but that moment come down from the hills, where he had been fighting so fiercely with the heathen that all his men were dead. Now he cried to Roland for help. "Noble Count, where are you? I am Walter of Hum, and am not unworthy to be your friend. Help me therefore, for see how my spear is broken and my shield cleft in twain. My hauberk is in pieces, and my body sorely wounded. I am about to die, but I have sold my life at great price." When Roland heard him cry, he set spurs to his horse and galloped to him. "Walter," said he, "you are a brave warrior and a trustworthy. Tell me now, where are the 1,000 valiant men whom you took from my army? They were right good soldiers, and I am sore in need of them." "They are dead," answered Walter. "You will see them no more. A sore battle we had with the Saracens yonder on the hills. They had the men of Canaan there, and the men of Armenia, and the giants. There were no better men in their army than these. We dealt with them, so they will not boast themselves of this day's work, but it cost us dear. All the men of France lie dead on the plain, and I am wounded to the death. And now, Roland, blame me not that I fled, for you are my lord, and all my trust is in you." "I blame you not," said Roland, "only as long as you live, help me against the heathen." And as he spake, he took his cloak and rent it into strips, and bound up Walter's wounds therewith. This done, he and Walter and the Archbishop set fiercely on the enemy. 25 did Roland slay, and Walter slew 6, and the Archbishop 5. 3 valiant men of war they were. Fast and firm they stood, one by the other. Hundreds there were of the heathen, but they dared not come near to these 3 valiant champions of France. They stood far off, and cast at the 3 spears and darts and javelins and weapons of every kind. Walter of Hum was slain forthwith, and the Archbishop's armour was broken, and he wounded, and his horse slain under him. Nevertheless he lifted himself from the ground, still keeping a good heart in his breast. "They have not overcome me yet," said he. "As long as a good soldier lives, he does not yield." Roland took his horn once more and sounded it, for he would know whether King Charles was coming. Ah me, it was a feeble blast that he blew. But the king heard it, and he halted and listened. "My lords," said he, "things go ill for us. I doubt not. Today we shall lose, I fear me much, my brave nephew Roland. I know by the sound of his horn that he has but a short time to live. Put your horses to their full speed, if you would come in time to help him, and let a blast be sounded every trumpet that there is in the army." So all the trumpets in the host sounded a blast. All the valleys and the hills re-echoed with the sound. Sore discouraged were the heathen when they heard it. King Charles has come again, they cried. We are all as dead men. When he comes, he shall not find Roland alive. Then 400 of them, the strongest and most valiant knights that were in the army of the heathen, gathered themselves into one company and made a yet fiercer assault on Roland. Roland saw them coming and waited for them without fear. So long as he lived, he would not yield himself to the enemy or give place to them. Better death than flight, said he, as he mounted his good steed, Waylantif, and rode towards the enemy. And by his side went Turpin the archbishop on foot. Then said Roland to Turpin, I am on horseback, and you are on foot. But let us keep together. Never will I leave you. We two will stand against these heathen dogs. They have not, I warrant, among them such a sword as Durendal. Good, answered the archbishop. Shame to the man who does not smite his hardest. And though this be our last battle, I know well that King Charles will take ample vengeance for us. When the heathen saw these two stand together, they fell back in fear, and hurled at them spears and darts and javelins without number. Roland's shield they broke, and his hauberk, but him they hurt not. Nevertheless, they did him a grievous injury, for they killed his good steed Waylantif. 30 wounds did Waylantif receive, and he fell dead under his master. At last the archbishop was stricken, and Roland stood alone, for the heathen had fled from his presence. When Roland saw that the archbishop was dead, his heart was sorely troubled in him. Never did he feel a greater sorrow for comrades slain, save Oliver only. Charles of France, he said, come as quickly as you may. Many a gallant knight have you lost in Roncesvalles, but King Marcellus, on his part, has lost his army. For one that has fallen on the side, there have fallen full 40 on that. So saying, he turned to the archbishop. He crossed the dead man's hands upon his breast, and said, I commit thee to the Father's mercy. Never has man served God with a better will. Never since the beginning of the world has there lived a sturdier champion of the faith. May God be good to you, and give you all good things. Now Roland felt that his own death was near at hand. In one hand he took his horn, and in the other his good sword Durendal, and made his way the distance of a furlong or so, till he came to a plain, and in the midst of the plain a little hill. On the top of the hill, in the shade of 2 fair trees, were 4 marble steps. There Roland fell in a swoon upon the grass. There a certain Saracen spied him. The fellow had feigned death, and had laid himself down among the slain, having covered his body and his face with blood. When he saw Roland, he raised himself from where he was lying among the slain, and ran to the place, and, being full of pride and fury, seized the count in his arms, crying loud, He is conquered! He is conquered! He is conquered! The famous nephew of King Charles. See, here is his sword. 'Tis a noble spoil that I shall carry back with me to Arabia. Thereupon he took the sword in one hand, with the other he laid hold of Roland's beard. But as the man lay hold, Roland came to himself, and knew that someone was taking his sword from him. He opened his eyes, but not a word did he speak, save this only, Fellow, you are none of ours. And he smote him a mighty blow upon his helmet. The steel he brake through, and the head beneath, and laid the man dead at his feet. Coward, he said, what made you so bold that you dared lay hands on Roland? Whosoever knows him will think you a fool for your deed. Roland's own death was very near, and now Roland knew that death was near at hand. He raised himself and gathered all his strength together. Ah me, how pale his face was, and took in his hand his good sword Durendal. Before him was a great rock, and upon this in his rage and pain he smote 10 mighty blows. Loud rang the steel upon the stone, but it neither brake nor splintered. Help me, he cried, O Mary our Lady, O my good sword, my Durendal, what an evil lot is mine. In the day when I must part with you, my power over you is lost. Many a battle I have won with your help, and many a kingdom I have conquered, that my Lord Charles possesses this day. Never has anyone possessed you that would fly before another. So long as I live, You shall not be taken from me, so long have you been in the hands of a loyal knight. Then he smote a second time with the sword, this time upon the marble steps. Loud rang the steel, but neither brake nor splintered. Then Roland began to bemoan himself. "O my good Durendal," he said, "how bright and clear thou art, shining as shines the sun. Well I mind me on the day when a voice that seemed to come from heavens bade King Charles give thee to a valiant captain, and forthwith the good king girded it on my side. Many a land have I conquered with thee for him, and now how great is my grief. Can I die and leave thee to be handled by some heathen?" And a third time he smote the rock with it. Loud rang the steel, but it brake not, bounding back as though it would rise to the sky. And when Count Roland saw that he could not break the sword, he spake again, but with more content in his heart. "O Durendal," he said, "a fair sword art thou, and holy as fair. There are holy relics in thy hilt, relics of St. Peter and St. Denis and St. Basil. These heathen shall never possess thee, nor shall thou to be held but by a Christian hand." And now Roland knew that death was very near to him. He lay down with his head upon the grass, putting unto him his horn and his sword, with his face turned towards the heathen foe. Ask you why he did so? To show, forsooth, to Charlemagne and the men of France that he died in the midst of victory. This done, he made a loud confession of his sins, stretching his hand to heaven. "Forgive me, Lord," he cried, "my sins, little and great, all that I have committed since the day of my birth to this hour in which I am stricken to death." So he prayed, and as he lay, he thought of many things, of the countries which he had conquered, and of his dear fatherland France, and of his kinsfolk, and of the good King Charles. Nor, as he thought, could he keep himself from sighs and tears. Yet one thing he remembered beyond all others, to pray for forgiveness of his sins. "O Lord," he said, "who art the God of truth, and didst save Daniel, thy prophet, from the lions, do thou save my soul and defend it against all perils." So speaking, he raised his right hand, with the gauntlet yet upon it, to the sky, and his head fell back upon his arm, and the angels carried him to heaven. So died the great Count Roland.
Cid. Unlike some of the other heroes told about in this book, the Cid was a real man, whose name was Rodrigo Diaz, or Rudiez. He was born in Burgos in the 11th century and won the name of Cid, which means conqueror, by defeating 5 Moorish kings. This happened after Spain had been in the hands of the Arabs for more than 300 years, so it is small wonder that the Spaniards looked upon their hero as a very remarkable man. When Rodrigo was still a youth, his father, Diego Lainez, was grossly insulted by Don Gomez. The custom in those days was to avenge such an insult by slaying the offender, but Diego was too old and feeble to bear arms. When he finally told his son of the wrong, Rodrigo sought out Don Gomez and challenged him to fight. So bravely and skillfully did Rodrigo manage his weapons that he slew his father's enemy. Then he cut off the head and carried it to Diego. Soon after this, Diego bade his son to do homage at King Ferdinand's court. Rodrigo appeared before the king, but his bearing was so defiant that Ferdinand was frightened, and banished him. Rodrigo departed with 300 followers, encountered some Moors who were invading Castile, defeated them, and took 5 of their kings captive, releasing them only after they had promised to pay tribute and to refrain from further warfare. It was these kings who first called him Cid. In return for his brave service, Rodrigo was restored to favor and given place among the king's courtiers. One day Dona Ximena, daughter of Don Gomez, appeared and demanded justice from the king. Recognizing Rodrigo among the courtiers, she called to him to slay her also. But both demand and cry were unheeded, for the king had been too well served by Rodrigo to listen to any accusation against him. 3 times the maiden returned with the same request, and each time she came she heard greater praise of the young hero. At last she decided to alter her demand. A 4th time she returned, consenting to forego all thoughts of vengeance if the king would order the young hero to marry her. The Cid was very willing, for he had learned to love the girl, admiring her beauty and spirit. The marriage was celebrated with great pomp, and the king gave Rodrigo 4 cities as a marriage portion. Rodrigo, vowing that he would not be worthy of his wife until he had won 5 battles, after a pious pilgrimage to the shrine of the patron saint, hastened off to Calora, a frontier town claimed by 2 kings, the King of Castile and Aragon. It had been decided that the dispute over the town should be settled by combat. Rodrigo became the champion of Ferdinand of Castile. The other champion, Martin Gonzalez, began as soon as the combat opened to taunt the Cid. "Never again will you mount your favorite steed, Babieca," he said. "Never will you return to your castle. Never will you see your beloved Ximena again." But the Cid was undaunted, and had soon laid his enemy low. Great praise then was given to the Cid, so great that the knights of Castile were jealous and plotted to kill him. But the Moorish kings, whom he had captured and released, warned him in time to avert the danger. Then the Cid aided Ferdinand in defeating the hostile Moors in Estremadura, after a siege of Coimbra lasting 7 months. Several other victories over his country's enemies were added to this, and Rodrigo returned to his beloved wife. But not for long was he permitted to remain in the quiet of home. Henry III, Emperor of Germany, complained to the Pope that King Ferdinand had refused to acknowledge his superiority. The Pope sent a message to Ferdinand, demanding homage and tribute. The demand angered both Ferdinand and the Cid. "Never yet have we done homage," cried the Cid, "and shall we now bow to a stranger?" A proud refusal was then sent to the Pope, and he, knowing of no better way to settle the dispute, bade Henry send a champion to meet Rodrigo. The Emperor's champion was, of course, defeated, and all of Ferdinand's enemies were so awed by the outcome of the fight that none ever again demanded homage or tribute. Rodrigo was, indeed, a very useful subject. When Ferdinand died, he was succeeded by his son, Don Sancho. The latter, planning a visit to Rome, selected the Cid to accompany him. Arriving, they found that in the preparations that had been made for their reception a lower seat had been prepared for Don Sancho than for the King of France. The Cid would not suffer such a slight, and became so violent that the Pope excommunicated him. Nevertheless, the seats were made of equal height, and the Cid, who was a good Catholic, humbled himself before the Pope and was forgiven. It was an age of great wars, and the Cid aided his king in many a brave fight. At last, in the siege of Zamora, the king was treacherously murdered, and, as he had no sons, Don Alfonso, his brother, succeeded. When he arrived at Zamora, the Cid refused to acknowledge Alfonso until he should swear that he had no part in the murder. The king, angered by Cid's attitude, plotted revenge. Opportunity came during a war with the Moors, and the Cid was banished upon a slight pretext. "I obey, O king," replied the Cid when he heard the decree. "I am more ready to serve you than you are to reward me. I pray that you may never more in battle need the right arm and sword that so often served your father." Then the Cid rode away, through a crowd of weeping people, and camped outside of the city until he could make definite plans. The people longed to bring him food or offer him shelter, but they feared the displeasure of the king. One old man, however, crept outside of the city with food, declaring that he cared not a fig for Alfonso's commands. The Cid needed money, and to get it he pledged 2 locked coffers to some Jews. The Jews in those days were much despised by the Christians, though usually very wealthy. The men, thinking that the boxes contained vast treasures, when in reality they were filled with sand, advanced the Cid 600 marks of gold. Then the hero bade farewell to his wife and children and rode away, vowing that he would return, covered with glory and carrying with him rich spoils. Within 2 weeks' time the Cid and his little band of followers had captured 2 Moorish strongholds, and carried off much spoil. The Cid then prepared a truly royal present and sent it to the king. Alfonso, upon receiving the gift, pardoned the Cid, and published an edict permitting all who wished to join in the fight against the Moors to join Rodrigo and his band. Toledo, thanks to the valor of the Cid, soon fell into the hands of Alfonso, but a misunderstanding arose, and the king insulted the Cid. The latter, in great rage, left the army and made a sudden raid on Castile. Then the Moors, knowing that the Cid had departed, took courage and captured Valencia. But the Cid, hearing of the disaster, promptly returned, recaptured the city, and sent a message to Alfonso asking for his wife and daughters. At the same time he sent more than the promised sum of money to the Jews, who up to this time had not learned that the coffers were filled with sand. To the messenger he said, "Tell them that although they can find nothing in the coffers but sand, they will find that the pure gold of my truth lies beneath the sand." As the Cid was now master of Valencia and of vast wealth, his daughters were sought in marriage by many suitors, and the marriage of both girls was celebrated with great splendor. But the Counts of Carrion, their husbands, were not brave men like the Cid, and after lingering at Valencia in idleness for 2 years, their weakness was clearly shown. One evening, while the Cid was sleeping, a lion broke loose from his private menagerie and entered the room where he lay. The 2 princes who were playing in the room fled, one in his haste falling into an empty vat, and the other taking refuge behind the Cid's couch. The roaring of the lion wakened the Cid, and jumping up, he seized his sword, caught the lion by the mane, led it back to its cage, and calmly returned to his place. The cowardly conduct of the Counts of Carrion roused the anger of the Cid's followers, and in the siege of Valencia that followed, their conduct brought only contempt. When the Moors were finally driven away, the counts asked permission to return home with their brides and gifts. So the Cid parted from his daughters, weeping at the loss. The procession started. The first morning the counts sent their escorts ahead, and left alone with their wives, stripped them of their garments, beat them and kicked them, and left them for dead. But Feliz Munoz, a loyal follower of the Cid's, riding back, found the 2 wives, bound up their wounds, and obtained shelter for them in the house of a poor man whose wife and daughters promised to nurse them. Then he rode on to tell the Cid. The Cid swore that he would be avenged, and as Alfonso was responsible for the marriage, he applied to him for redress. The king, who had long since forgiven the Cid and learned to value his services, was very angry. A battle was finally arranged. The Counts of Carrion and their uncle were defeated and banished, and the Cid returned in triumph to Valencia. Here his daughter's second marriage took place. The Moors returned 5 years later, and the Cid was prepared to meet them when he received a vision of St. Peter, predicting that he would die within 30 days, but that even through death he would triumph over his enemy. He accordingly made preparations for his death, and after appointing a successor, he gave instructions that none should weep over his death, and that his body, when embalmed, should be set upon his horse, Babashia, and that, with his sword Tezona in his hand, he should be led on a certain day against the enemy. The hero died, and his successor, together with his wife Ximena, strove to carry out his instructions. A battle was planned, and the Cid, strapped upon his war horse, rode in the van. The Moors, filled with terror, fled before him. After the victory, the body was placed in the church of San Pedro de Cardena, where for 10 years it remained seated in plain view of all. End of chapter 24.